What's going on, everybody? So in this video, we're going to be building a to-do app using React and Django and combining those two. Before I start each video, I like to just go ahead and show you what we have and show that base project. So let's go ahead and just get into that. And if you look at my screen here, we have this to-do app where we're able to complete items by clicking them. We get this strike through, and we're also able to add new items and edit items simply by clicking on them and doing something like this. So whenever we hit update, submit that, that's our new item, it's added, and that's all this app does. So I actually created this app with a REST API that we built out using the Django REST framework, and we did a video with vanilla JavaScript building the same exact thing. So what we're gonna do is just build off of that and use React this time. And if you're not familiar with the Django REST framework, I highly recommend you watch that last video, but we're working off of that source code, so you could just go ahead, download that source code, and start right where I'm at. I'll cover all the URL patterns and how we're making those API calls, but make sure you watch that. I'll link it up in the video description. So let's go ahead and just get right into the code and start building this thing out. Okay, so for those of you that don't want to follow the last video on the Django REST framework, you could just go ahead and grab this source code that I'm going to have in the description, and let's go ahead and just download this and get a few things set up here. So I'm just going to go ahead and download this zip file, and we're going to get it set up on our desktop here, and we'll also do a couple of imports and a few installs once we have it. So we'll go ahead and just take care of that right now. Okay, so I have my project here, and I've opened up two command prompts because I am going to have one running on port 8000. That's going to be our Django app. And then whenever we set up our React app, that's going to be on port 3000. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's go ahead and just do, we'll CD into that to-do app. So I'm in my desktop. We'll do to-do _drf. And again, that file is right here. And once I get here, I'm going to go ahead and set up my virtual environment. So do this however you choose, but we'll set this up and then I'll go over my source code. So we'll just do virtual env, and I'm going to call that env. And I'm going to give this a minute, so I'm probably going to pause the video as this downloads because this takes a second, and then we'll run our pip installs. Okay, so we have our virtual environment, and I just opened up my text editor to this file right here. So here are my project files, there's the environment, and I'll go over the source code in a second, but once we activate that environment, I just want to go ahead and pip install everything in my requirements.txt. So the main thing that we need from here is going to be this Django REST framework because that's how we set up the original project. So we'll just do env scripts and activate. And now we can just do pip install and then -r and then everything in the requirements.txt file. So I'll go ahead and let that run again, and I need to go ahead and create the space here. So again, I'll pause the video because this is going to take a second. If you don't have Django installed and all that other stuff, this might take a minute, so we'll just get back to it. Okay, so we have all the pip installs complete, and what I want to do now is just recap some of the source code. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we have our app here, which we called API. Again, we set this up in the Django REST framework intro video. So we have our serializer, we have our model, which is just a task because this is a to-do app. So we have the task with a title, and then the status of completed of true or false, just a Boolean value. And we have our views here, and I'll also open up the urls.py file. So these are all the URL paths that we can type in order to retrieve data or manipulate it. And if I go in here, if we go to that base URL path, so anything with our domain and then /API, we'll get back this these routes here. So it's just going to be a dictionary that'll show us the routes we can access, and then our list view, detail view, and then the ability to create, update, and delete. So let's go ahead and turn on our server and actually check those out, and then we'll create our React app. So manage.py, run server, and this will take a second, so we'll go ahead and open that up. Okay, so if we open up the base app, the way I have this project set up, nothing's gonna work here, so we're gonna get this error because we have not set up a template. That's what we're gonna have React eventually take care of. But if we do /API, we can actually see that first view. So there's our list. And then if we go ahead and just access this one right here, so API /task list, we have our 2 objects here. So if you ran the install from this GitHub link, I actually included the SQLite database. So if you want to start working with that or eventually set your own up, just go ahead and create a few items so you can actually have something to work with. But it's right here and we have a user. So from here, let's go ahead and open up our other command prompt. And right within the desktop, what I'm going to do is open up a React app side by side, and then eventually we'll merge it. So we'll actually do the run build and then have React run on port 8000. But while we're creating this, we want to be able to just make the updates and then see everything on port 3000. And I'll just show you how to connect that. So let's just do npx and then create-react-app. And then I'm going to call my app front end. So this is just going to handle the front end of our app here. So that's what we'll call it. And then again, I'll pause the video because this is going to take a minute to install and get everything set up, but we'll be right back when it's complete. Okay, so that install was complete, and I actually had to run it again because I don't know if you noticed, but I spelled front end wrong. But I reran that, and we now have the folder right here. So we have the Django project and the React project, and I also opened that up in a text editor right here. So I'll go ahead and just split this screen, and we'll actually start styling this thing. So if we go to source, we have our app.js file, and I'll just make sure the syntax is properly highlighted. And then we have our app.css file right here. So let's go ahead and cd into that project and actually go ahead and actually start it. So front end, oh, there we go. Okay, so we're in that project, and now we can do npm start, and this will open up our React app on port 3000. So if I open up my browser, we should see it right here. And here we go. So here's our React app on port 3000 and our Django app on port 8000. So what we're going to do is actually clean up this this default application right here, and I'll go ahead and start styling this thing out and adding some CSS before we actually get into making those API calls. So I have actually pre-built sort of a template already. So we'll go ahead and just copy and paste code, and I will go over it line by line. So I'll cover what everything is, but I just didn't want to spend too much time on things like HTML and CSS on a React Django video. So let's go ahead and do that. So in here, what I'm going to do is actually clear out this component and change it to a class-based component, and we'll go ahead and build everything in here. So everything is going to be actually within one component. So I'm not going to go over best React practices. This is more of a just how we can integrate the two and actually make those calls. So we're just going to handle the form itself and the list right here. So this will just be extends and then react.component, and we'll bring out the render method. And within render, we'll also throw in return. So render, return, and return is where our entire app is going to reside. So within return, what we need to do is create that that main wrapper. So I'll copy and paste that main wrapper here, and we're going to be using Bootstrap for that. So we're going to call that container. And within container, we're going to have two subcontainers. So actually just one, and then subcontainers within that. So within container, we're going to create another container called task container. And task container is going to be in charge of holding the form and our list. So we gave it the ID of task container, and it holds these two divs, so form wrapper and list wrapper. And within list wrapper, we're going to pre-populate that dynamically when we make that API call. But within form wrapper, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste some more code, and we'll cover those line by line. So we'll paste this in. And here we have our form, and we're using the flex box here. So we have our form, which we gave the ID of form, and then we have another wrapper that's going to create that flex box for us, and then we just created two divs to create inline styling for our input field and our submit button. So we also have an ID of title for that input field, and then just that submit button. And if I save this and clear out our CSS, we should see a new template with no styling at this point. So let's see what's wrong here. Looks like we have an error. I spelled extends wrong. So let's fix that. So that's extends, and then there we go. I thought I saw an issue there. So we have extends. So there's our form input field. There's our submit button, and then no data there. So now if we go into our public folder right here and inside index.html, so this is our main template, we're gonna go ahead and import Bootstrap. So you could just do a Google search for that. I already have the link and this will be in the source code. So I'm gonna paste that in. And one other thing is I wanted my own Google font. So you can do a search for any font you want or go ahead and just skip this step, but that's gonna import a specific font that I wanna use for my template here. So if we close that out and just go ahead and open up this link, we're gonna notice that Bootstrap already added a few things based on the classes we have in the button and that input field. So if you look at input right here, we have form control. That's why our form is styled that way. So now we're gonna do the CSS. So in this CSS, the first thing we're gonna do is the body and the text. So text is just gonna be that font that I imported, and the body is gonna be a specific background. So it's gonna be a gradient background with green and blue. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So it gives us this background, and now what we wanna do is center this right here and give it that white background for the actual list and form. And if you notice, the reason why we're not doing run build right away in configuring that is because I'm able to save this and see updates right away on port 3000. So it just saves us some time and makes things faster. So the next thing is that task container. So we'll throw that in, and that is because that main container, which starts here and ends right here, is set to 600 pixels and it has its own background with a shadow. So I'll just keep showing you what we're working on here. So there we go. And now the next thing is going to be that form wrapper. So form wrapper is right here. So here's the ID and it ends right here. And that just makes our form a little bit better, centers it, and gives us that padding. And then finally, I'll just go ahead and import or paste in 4 more things here. So we have that submit button. I didn't want it to have that yellow effect, so I just did an override on that Bootstrap button, and then that flex wrapper in order to inline everything. So inline that input field and button, and then the task wrapper itself, and just a little bit of styling for whenever we hover over an actual item. So we won't see that until we render it. So here we go. Our button is now inlined. That's because of that, again, that flex box. And now we just need to go ahead and set our state and start making some API calls. So if we go back to our app here and just under component right here, let's go ahead and create our constructor before we create that state. So constructor, and we'll just go ahead and do that and throw in props right here. And within the constructor, let's go ahead and now create super. And we'll also throw in props to super. So props, and now we can set our state. So close that off. And to set the state, we'll just go this dot state. And we need a few items here. So the first thing is the to-do list. So we'll camel case that, and we'll just set that to an empty list. Then what we want to have is an active item. So we'll just do active item, and we'll also camel case that. And active item is going to have a few attributes here. So we're going to give it the ID, and by default, there's going to be no item there at first. And we're also going to give it the title, which is just going to be an empty string. And then the status of completed. So completed, and that's going to equal to false. So this is the item. Whenever we click edit, we're going to pre-populate this with the current item that we clicked on. So we just want to have an area to actually hold that. So with that being said, all we need to do now is just add editing. So editing just basically lets us know, are we editing an item or are we submitting a new one? And you'll see where this comes in handy later. So we'll set editing by default to false, and we need to make this a comma and also do this dot state equals to, and then whatever we call the state. So for our lifecycle method, I'm going to use component will mount. And whenever this gets called, we are going to trigger another function called fetch tasks. And fetch tasks is going to be in charge of making an API call and then rendering out that data. But for now, just to make sure everything's working, we're going to do console.log and we'll just say fetching. And now we just want to bind it. So under our state, we're going to take this function, and just underneath our state, we are going to bind it. So we'll do this dot fetch tasks, and we'll do this dot fetch tasks is equal to the dot bind. And this is just binding it. And if you know React, you should be already familiar with this, but this basically gives us access to this method within fetch tasks. So let's go ahead and call it. So within component will mount, we'll just do this dot fetch tasks, and we'll just go ahead and see if this console's out. So we should see fetching within the console here. So if I open up my browser and do inspect, we should see it loaded when component is mounted or before it's mounted. So there we go. So we see fetching, and if I refresh that, everything's working right. It's been binded and it's consoling it out. So now what we're going to do is use the fetch API to actually make those API calls to this URL here. So we're going to grab this, and within our fetch tasks function here, we're going to do fetch, and for the URL, we're going to pass it in as a string value, and we're just going to call that URL path. So we'll do dot then, and we just need to convert the response into a JSON response. So dot then, and we'll set response using an arrow function, and this will just be response dot JSON. And we need to do this one more time. So once we convert that data, we'll do another dot then, and for this, we just want to console out the data. So we're actually going to get an error here, and that's because of CORS, so cross-origin resource sharing, I believe is what it stands for. And this is basically happening because we need to actually allow this URL path to, or the port 8000 to actually connect with our Django app. And I'll show you what I mean by this. So if we try to console that data, and we'll just do dot data. So if we try to do this, what's happening here is we're trying to call this this URL path, but we're doing it from port 3000. So it's trying to make that call, and then it's blocking it because it doesn't trust wherever we're trying to actually access this. So what we're going to do is within our Django app is let it know that, hey, anything coming from port 3000 or whatever URLs we specify, go ahead and allow this call and let it actually access the data. So for this, we are going to use CORS header. So this is Django CORS header. We're just going to run this pip install, and we need to configure a few things in our settings.py. So I'm going to copy this and turn off our Django server, and I'll just move this to the left so we can see everything. And we'll just do pip install, didn't let me copy that, and that's Django-CORS-headers. So pip install Django-CORS-headers. And once that's installed, I'm just going to do a pip freeze because I want to add this to that requirements.txt. So pip freeze requirements. Okay, so, and I'm just doing that just for whenever I upload the source code so we can have it within our Django app in this requirements.txt file. So there we go, Django CORS headers. So now what we want to do is within our base directory, so within settings.py file, we want to add in CORS headers. So that's added just as one word. So if I do CORS header within installed apps here, we throw that in. So we now have access to it, and we need to add it to middleware too. So I got all this from the documentation, so I'll link this up, but it's all in here. So we add it into installed apps, and then we're going to grab this. So we're taking that, pasting that into our middleware, and I'll just throw that above here. And then we also need to whitelist it, I believe, whitelist a URL, which basically means go ahead and allow this URL. So we'll take this right here, and we're going to paste it at the bottom of our settings.py file. So in here, just under, at the bottom here, just under static URL, we're going to remove all of these, and the port we want to allow is going to be port 3000. So we'll change that to port 3000 because that's where we're calling from our React app. And if I go ahead and run our server, we should now be able to actually make that API call and get that data. So give it a second here. And if we go back to our React app and refresh it, there we go. So we're consoling out our data and we successfully made that API call. So this is actually an issue that I've seen a lot of people run into whenever they're trying to configure these two, or just in general try to actually make their API maybe more open source. But that's how we're able to actually whitelist URLs and change that up. So we can, if you look at this, it's actually a list. So we can add as many URLs as we want, or just whitelist all the URLs. And I think to do that, all you need to do is star like that. But I don't remember the exact method. But yeah, it's possible, and it takes care of that issue. So let's go ahead and actually render that data out and build our table. So we'll go back to our fetch tasks here. And instead of just consoling out the data, I'm actually going to set the state to the response data here. So we're going to do this dot set state, and we're going to set the value of to-do list to whatever we get back from that API call. So we're just going to set data to be the value of to-do list. And what's going to happen here is every time state is updated, we're going to re-render our template here, or our component, and we want to start looping through those tasks and actually rendering that data out. So I'm going to set a variable called tasks, and tasks is going to be equal to this.state.to-do list. So we're going to go through tasks and actually start mapping through it and rendering everything out inside list wrapper here. So we'll just go ahead and set these curly braces here, and we'll do tasks.map. And we're going to use a traditional function for this instead of arrow functions, just to make things a little simpler for those people that don't understand arrow functions that well. And in here, what we want to do is go ahead and set return, and we're going to output the actual list wrapper, or the task wrapper item there. So in here, in the function, we want to pass in two things. So we want to pass in the object. So that's the object that we're actually going to reference in the current iteration of the loop, and the index of the current iteration we're in. So let's go ahead and create a div here, and inside this div, we're going to give it a key and a few classes here. So for the key, we're just going to go ahead and give it the unique value of the index. So again, this needs to be unique to each item. There can be a duplicate, and in this case, each iteration will be unique. And for the class name, let's go ahead and give it this task wrapper right here. So we'll give it the task wrapper, and then we'll go ahead and give it flex wrapper. So flex wrapper is just to keep things in line and make sure that we can actually style everything in line the way we need it. And in here, let's just go ahead and add a span tag, and we'll output some data just to see that it's working, and then we'll carry on from here. So span, and in here, we'll just use two single curly braces, and we can just do task. So we're accessing the object right here, and we're just going to do task.title, and we're going to output that. So let's just go ahead and make sure it's working right. And there we go. So we have two items. And the reason why we're using that flex box there is because we need to add some buttons here and basically put it in line without having to do floats or anything like that. So let's go ahead and just finish it up then. And within each wrapper here, we're going to create three divs here. So three boxes. So we're going to create one for the title, and we'll just close this off. And we'll indent this so we can see it, and I'll actually create some space so we can actually see each item correctly. And we're going to go ahead and style this inline, and the styling for this is going to be, we'll do two double curly braces, and we'll just do flex 7. So this is going to be the widest object in the list. And then for these, we'll just do two more. We'll set this one to 1, and this one right here also to 1. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste the button here, and we'll first do the edit button. And the edit button just has some bootstrap styling that we eventually converted into our own styling based on our CSS here. So the first button here is just, it just says edit, and it's an outline button, and it's blue. And the next button is just going to have a dash through it, and this is going to be to delete items, and it's black here. So again, that's the text in it. It's just that dash and the edit. So let's go ahead and check that now. There we go. So it's all in line and the styling is complete. So what we want to do now, before we actually create that strike through, we'll go ahead and allow this form to submit and actually create some data. Then we'll handle update, delete, and then that strikeout method. There's a few different ways we can go about creating an item, and the method I'm going to use is going to be to add an event listener that listens to changes to this input field right here. And on change, what we're going to do is actually set the state of our active item. So the active item will be updated, and then we're going to create another function that will actually, on submission, it will grab that active item state and submit the data. And this will later change whenever we're editing an item too. So we're always going to fill out that active item. So let's go ahead and under fetch tasks here, let's go ahead and create a function called handle change. So this is going to be a simple function. And again, it's just going to listen to key up events. And within this function, what we want to do is first grab the name. So the name of the attribute that we're editing. And in this case, we're just going to do e.target.name. So that's going to be the name of the input field. So that's title. And we're also going to grab the title to the item that we're creating. So the value will be e.target.value. So let's go ahead and just console these out, make sure it's all working, and then we'll actually start setting the state. So console.log, and let's go ahead and just say name is going to equal to name, and then we're also going to do the same for value. So we'll copy and paste that and set this to value. Okay, so before we go ahead and do that, let's go ahead and bind this. So up here, we need to bind it and then add the event handler. So we'll say this dot handle submit, and that's going to be equal to this dot handle submit dot bind, and we're going to bind this. And then in the component right here, what I want to do, because we can't access this within, actually we can just go ahead and access it directly. I was confusing that with a loop. So in here, let's just go ahead and say on change, and we'll set that to the function. So we'll just say this dot handle submit or handle change. So we have handle change binded. We created the function, and on change is just going to console out the name and the value. So let's go ahead and give that a test and see if it's all working. We'll refresh that, and let's just say Dennis. So there we go. Each time we're typing it in, we're consoling out the title and the name. So now that we have that set, let's set the state. And for this, all we have to do is here, we can just do this dot set state. And we need to set the state of the active item. So because we're updating child elements, we're going to use a spread operator to actually update this. So I don't want to get into the detail of it. So I'll just go ahead and just do this. And then I highly recommend you look this up if you don't understand how to update child items in a state. So for this, we're just going to do dot 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 this dot state dot active item. So this is the attribute we're updating. And then within here, we're just going to say we want to update the title. So for this, we're just going to say, let's go ahead and just get the value, and we'll update that. So now to actually see this active item and to make sure that it actually worked, let's go ahead and create a function called handle submit. And this function is going to trigger whenever we submit the form. And first, it's going to go ahead and prevent the form from submitting. So e.prevent default, because we want to manually submit that. And then let's just go ahead and console.log the item. So item is going to be active item here. So we'll set that and say this.state.active item. Okay, so on submission, we're going to console out that item. So let's go ahead and bind handle submit up here. And we'll just change this to handle submit. And also update this one right here. So now all we have to do is go ahead and add an event handler to our form here. So within our form, we're just going to do on submit. And on submit, we're just going to go ahead and call that new function. So we're just going to do this dot handle submit. And in handle submit, we're just consoling out that active item. So let's go ahead and test that. And we'll just do Dennis, submit that. And there we go. So there's our active item. So it looks like that key up event did work properly. And we are now needing to submit this title right here and that entire object actually to our create method. So Within handle submit, once we console that out, we're actually going to use the fetch API to send post data to a different URL. So we're going to set a URL, and this is going to be dynamic to whatever data we're passing in. So whether this is update or delete data. So if I go back to my API, and if we go to this base API, we can see that in order to create an item, we need to do API/task.create. I'll just go ahead and grab all of this right here and throw that in as our base URL, and then we'll dynamically update it later. So now that I have the URL, we can go ahead and just use the fetch API. And in here, we're going to throw in the URL, and then we're actually going to have to send some data with that. So the method is going to be post, and we'll just put that in a string value. And then we're going to throw in another object, and this is just going to be for the headers. So headers, we'll actually pass in some more data here, and we're going to set the content type, and that's going to be with a capital C, and content-type, and this is just going to be application/JSON. So now that we have that, we're going to pass in something later. We're actually going to pass in a CSRF token for our form, but we'll leave it out for now, and I just want to go over that on its own later. But we're also just going to finish this up with a body. So for the body, because this is the fetch API, we need to stringify the data. So JSON.stringify, and in the stringify method, we're just going to go ahead and throw in the active item. So this.state.active_item. So we're just going to grab the active item, throw it in there, and then we're going to go ahead and get that response there. So we'll just do response with an arrow function. And then we just want to go ahead and set the new state and call fetch tasks again. So we'll just do this.fetchTasks, and let's go ahead and set the state. So this.setState, and we want to set the state for the active item. So we've had an active item, but after we submit it, we want to clear it. So what I'll do is just go ahead and grab this entire item and throw that into set state. There's probably more efficient ways of doing this, but this will also work. So we'll throw in that item, and now we want to catch any errors. So we'll just do .catch, and in here we'll just do function. We'll grab the error, and we'll just return, or we'll console out whatever the error was. So console.log, and we'll just say error, and we'll throw in whatever that was. So now if we go to our form here and we start creating a new item, so we'll just say Dennis, and we submit that, we should see a new item get created. So there we go. Our new list was fetched here, and we rendered out that data. So what's happening here is whenever we're submitting it, we're sending it to this URL, which calls in this view right here. So we send it to task create, we send it to that serializer, we throw in the data, and we check if it's valid, and then we save it. So on the front end, what happens is after we submit it, we go ahead and call fetch tasks again, and we reset the active item. So right now we're able to submit the data, and I'm not sure why this error kind of changes up on me, but to my understanding, we have to send a CSRF token to Django. So right now it's submitting without it. I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that the error is occurring because I've had it to where it happens and then it doesn't. So it's kind of confusing me. I'll have to do some more research, but for now, I'm just gonna play it safe and assume that we're gonna get that error every time. So what I'm gonna do is actually go ahead and pull in the Django documentation. And if you watched my Django video with this with vanilla JavaScript, I already covered this, but basically we need to create a cookie here. So this is the Django documentation, and it tells us how to do this with Ajax. We need to create a cookie and then just pass it into our headers here. So we're just gonna throw in a CSRF token right here. Where is that? Handle submit. So we're gonna throw it in through the header. So let's go ahead and just create that. So I'm gonna copy and paste that and just get rid of a few things. So, and we're gonna grab this entire function here and add this into our React app. So just above handle submit is where, actually I'll add it just underneath or just above component will mount because it's kind of its own item. So we'll remove function right there and we'll go ahead and bind it. So I'll go ahead and duplicate that and we'll just say get cookie, throw that in there. And now we want to use it within our handle submit function. So what I'm going to do is set a variable called cookie or a CSRF token. So var CSRF token, and that's going to be equal to this dot get cookie. And we just need to get the CSRF token just like the Django documentation tells us to. So we're just going to use that method right there, and we're going to pull that in and then pass it through our headers. So CSRF token, and in our headers right here, just under content type, we're just going to do x-CSRF token with a capital T, and then the rest will be lowercase, and we're just going to pass in that CSRF token. So this is the proper way that Django wants us to pass in that token. It's just a safe way to do this. I'm not sure why I wasn't getting that error. I'll do some research on that later, but I might as well play it safe and make sure we submit it each time. And one thing before we submit that form and actually test that token, I want to make sure that we are clearing our form whenever we submit it. So what I'm going to do is go to that input field, and where's value? So I'll just go ahead and set the value, and that will be equal to this dot state dot active item dot title. So whenever we reset that the active item title, it'll go ahead and clear out the form. So I'm going to test that now, and this is now passing in that token. And if I just do one, submit that, our form is cleared, and it looks like it sent it in properly. So that's with the token being passed in. Okay, so we completed the hardest part, which is that form submission. And now what we want to do is go ahead and add an event handler that sets this form to the value that we clicked on, and then change the active item to that object, and also change the value of editing to true. So we're going to set the state of whatever object we clicked on and change that value. So we're going to do that with a function called start edit. And this function is going to be in charge of just changing that state, and then depending on whatever value we have in editing is going to change the URL submission and decide whether we're updating an item or creating a new one. So we'll just pass in task, and that's going to be the object that we clicked on. And then we're just going to do this dot set state, and set state is going to change the value of two different things. So it's going to change the active item, and in here we're just going to throw in the task, and we're going to change editing to true. So that's set to true, and now we can go ahead and just add an event handler down here that allows us to actually update that. So because our function takes in a parameter, we're going to have to call it a little bit differently inside this loop here. So on click, we're going to use the arrow function, and we're just going to go ahead and say start edit, and we're going to pass in the task. So the current task in the iteration of the loop, we're going to go ahead and throw it in, and that's how we're able to access it right within here. So another problem that occurs is normally we access a function with this keyword right here. Well, this isn't going to be available within this loop. So what I'm going to do is change it to self, and we're going to set the value of self to this. So var self, and that's going to be equal to this. So this will allow us to access this within the loop right here. So that's going to be self, and we pass in the parameter because of this arrow function, and now that should work. So let's go ahead and test that and see if it's working. So I'll refresh it and click one, Dennis, install DRF. So that's all working. The event handler is catching it, and we're setting the state. The next thing we need to do is actually change the value on submission. So right now, if we submit one of these, what's going to happen here is we're actually going to have a new item created, because that URL takes in the active item here. So it takes in this item, which was the one we clicked on, and it passes into our handle submit. It passes it to the URL of create. So we're going to write a little conditional here. So just underneath this variable URL, we're going to check a conditional and change the value depending on the state of editing. So remember, whenever we click on that edit button, editing is set to true. So we're going to change the state, and we're going to say if this dot state dot editing, if this is equal to true, go ahead and change the value of URL. So I'm going to throw that in here. And we're going to use template literals because we're passing in a dynamic value of the item ID here. So if we go back to our API, if we look at this, task create and task update are pretty similar, except for we say update. and we pass in the item ID here. So let's go ahead and just grab this, and I'll throw that into that URL, change this to update, and for this, we're just gonna go ahead and create that / $symbol and curly braces, and then I'm just gonna pass in the item ID. So the active item has an ID up here if we look at the actual state here. So we're gonna throw this value in. So now it's set to the ID of whichever item we clicked on. And if I can find this, so we'll just change that to this.id. So now that we submit it, we'll just set the value of the state. So we're gonna say this.state, and we wanna change, actually it's gonna be set state. We wanna change the value of editing back to false and ready to either create or update a new item. So we're gonna set editing to false now. So it's always gonna update it until we click on that edit button. So let's go ahead and test this. So if I go back here, let's refresh it and click on install Django REST framework, hit update, submit that, there we go. So now the item was sent to the update URL, which sends it back to our view. And because of that pattern, we go ahead and query the item by the ID, set it as the instance, and save it. So that's the update method. Let's go ahead and actually delete an item. So if we go back to our code, we're gonna create a function similar to start edit here. So whenever we click on the delete button, we're gonna trigger a function on click, and we're actually gonna pass in a task into a delete item function. And this function is actually gonna send data back and delete this item. So I'll go ahead and create it underneath start edit here, and we'll just call it delete item. And we're also gonna need to pass in the task here. So we'll pass in the task, and we're also gonna need the CSRF token. So I'll steal that from handle submit because we are sending data. So we're gonna need to pass this in, and we'll throw that in there. And we're gonna use fetch to send the delete method to our API here. So if you go to our view, it takes in not a post method, but a delete method. And if you look at the URL pattern, it's just this base URL, which I'm gonna copy right now. And we're just gonna do task-delete, and then the item ID of which we're trying to delete. So let's go ahead and throw that in. And I'm gonna use template literals again. So we're gonna do that base URL, task-delete, and then the item ID is gonna be what we passed in into that parameter. So we'll take this and we'll just do task.id. So now what we wanna do is go ahead and set the method and the header. So the method is gonna be delete, and for the headers, we're just gonna send in the content type and the CSRF token. So that's another object, and we'll just say content type, and it looks like it's autofilling for me. So content type is gonna be application /JSON, and the CSRF token is just gonna be x-CSRF token, and we'll just pass in what we created right here. So that data is gonna be sent in, and now what we wanna do is just create the response and rebuild that list after an item is deleted. So we're just gonna say .then, and our response, and we're just gonna use the arrow function again. So response, and we'll just go ahead and call this .fetch tasks. So it'll just go ahead and reload all that data after we delete an item. So let's go ahead and just bind it. So I'll just copy this, and we'll go ahead and just say delete item. And I'm actually not sure if I need to bind this. I don't know why edit worked without it, but I'll actually just do edit item 2, so, or start edit. It looked like it worked without it, but just to be safe, I'll throw that in there. And now what we need to do is add the event handler. So down here on click, we use the arrow function again. So I'm just gonna go ahead and throw that into the delete button function, and we're just gonna say delete item. So the same thing, we call it, we're gonna use self. And now if I go ahead and refresh this, I just realized I actually have an error up here. So not L, but that needs to be a colon. And now let's try that one more time. So if I go ahead and delete an item, the item's deleted and the table is refreshed. So if we wanna update, we can just say update. And if we wanna create a new one, we'll just say new item. And there we go. So everything looks like it's working all right. What we want to do is actually cross off items whenever they're considered complete, and then actually give us the ability to click on this and cross them off manually. So we'll just go ahead and take care of that. So back in our code here, what we need to do is render this title out depending on whether this item is complete or not. We need to render it out differently. So if I look back into my list here, we have one item with the status of completed as true and this one as false. So whenever the item is complete, let's go ahead and strike it off the list. So let's go ahead and write that conditional. So in here, we'll just use our curly braces, and we're going to say if the task dot completed, if this is equal to true or false, let's go ahead and render this out as we normally would. So if it's false, we'll just go ahead and use this normal span tag here, and we'll just paste that in here. But if it's completed, if the status is completed, we'll go ahead and render it out differently. So we'll paste in that span tag again, and we'll just change this to strike. So if it's completed, render it out as text. If it's not, go ahead and strike it out. So if I save this, we'll clean this up a little bit, clear out this space, and let's see in our template if it did that. So there we go, the item's striked out. What we need to do now is add an event handler that allows us to click on this and change that status and then re-render that list. So let's go ahead and take care of that. And this function we're going to call strike unstrike. So it's just going to invert the value. So strike unstrike, and it is going to take in the task. So once we pass in the task, what we're going to do is set the value of task.completed, and we're going to make it the opposite of the current value. So task completed is going to equal to task.completed, and it's going to be, again, the opposite of what the last value was. So completed, and then we're just going to console it out. So console.log, and we're just going to say task, and let's just console out the task.completed status. So task.completed, and I'm going to quickly bind this and add it as an event handler. So in here, just throw it in as the last method we have, and we'll finish this up. So strike unstrike, we'll change this one here, and we're going to add the event handler right onto the title, I believe. So let me take a look at my demo code here, and that's going to go directly onto the div wrapping that. So we're going to say on click, we're actually just going to copy this. So on click, and we're going to have to put that into an arrow function, and we'll just throw that in there. So we're going to call strike unstrike, and let's go ahead and take a look. So if we try to click on this, we should see this consoled out right here. So it's set to true, then false, true, false. So let's go ahead and actually send this data now. So we're going to use fetch again, and we are going to need that CSRF token. So we'll throw that in here, and we're going to set the variable URL to the same value as what we sent in that post data. So, or in that create update method. So we'll take this, and we want the active item, except for we need to update the active item ID to task ID. So we're going to go ahead and send this data, and it's going to update the status of completed. So with fetch, we're just going to repeat a bunch of what we've already been doing. We'll throw in the URL here, and we'll pass in some data. So the method is going to be post, and for the headers, we're just going to go ahead and pass in the CSRF token and content type. So I'm just going to copy this right here and set that. Repeating ourselves a lot here. So pass that in, and then we just need the response. Actually, no, we need the body because this is post data. So we'll go ahead and set the body, and this one we'll just manually create. So we are going to have to do json.stringify. And within here, I'm just going to manually create the object. So we're going to set the value of completed to whatever we just inverted it into. So we're just taking this new value, and we're going to throw that in, and we're also going to pass in the title. So title is going to be, and I'm just doing this to be safe because I don't want a bunch of errors in a demo video like this. So just to be safe, we'll just do task.title, and we're sending that data, and then finally we just want to get the response. So we'll do .then, and we'll just set response to call that this.fetch tasks method here. So that should go ahead and send the new data, update it, and I just want to make sure we're passing in task ID. Everything looks correct. So we're going to update it, and then we're gonna re-render that form. So in here, what it's gonna look like is right on the spot. You're not even gonna see that re-render. It's updating it and it looks great. So the last thing we're gonna do now, and just wanna test the delete method. The last thing we're gonna do in this video is actually merge the two projects together. So instead of having to run both servers, we're gonna run build and then actually have Django serve this template here on port 8000 and replace this URL here. So Django and React will be merged together, and then it'll be considered one app with React hosting the front end. So I'll close this out, and we are gonna drag in this React app, so the front end part, into our Django app. So I need to make sure that my text editor is closed because I don't think it'll let me do this. And we're just gonna drag it straight into the root directory. So this is gonna take a few minutes. So I'll go ahead and pause it, and once this is complete, we'll go ahead and just run build and complete the configuration. Okay, so the final steps to this should be pretty easy. We now have our React app within our Django project. So front end right there is now sitting within our React app. And if we pull up our Django project, we should see it in here. So we have our app API, that's the backend, and then the React app with the front end part right there. So React, and here's our app.js file, and so on. So what we need to do is configure the two. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is go ahead and CD into that React app, and we need to run build. So now I'm in desktop and my Django project, and we're just gonna do front end, and we're just gonna do npm run build. So this is gonna take a second, and after we run build, we're gonna go ahead and configure that root URL. Okay, so run build's complete, and what that means is within our React app, we now have build, and we have access to these static assets right here. So we have the static assets, and we also have the index.html file. So what we need to do is tell Django, go ahead and look for this index.html file. So we need to go to settings.py and let Django know about this template first. So in here, we're just gonna go to templates, and we're gonna set a path to actually go ahead and track this template down in build and then index.html somewhere here. There it is. So for that, we're just gonna do os.path.join, and we're gonna set the base directory, so base dir, and we're just gonna go ahead and do the path to the root directory, so front end, into the app, and then we're gonna look inside the build folder. So that should send the path to front end, build, and then it's gonna know to find index.html. So in here, what we need to do now is configure our URLs. So inside URLs, we need to run an import, and we're just gonna render out a template view. So it's gonna be a class-based view, and we're just gonna do from Django.views.generic import, and we're just gonna do template view. So we originally got this template rendered out right here. That's because in our root directory, or in that root URL, we had nowhere to send it. So we're gonna create that right now. So we're gonna create a path for that root directory or domain, and this is just gonna be template view dot as_view, and we're gonna look for a file called index.html. So that's gonna be this index.html inside of build and right there. So we have that path set, and the last thing we need to do is let Django know about React static files. So down here, we're gonna need to configure that. So we're just gonna go ahead and create static files underscore directories, and that's gonna equal to this list right here. And I'm actually just gonna copy and paste the same path here and just update one little thing in here. So we're gonna take this one right here, and down here, we're just gonna paste that in, and we're gonna say we're looking for front end, and we're looking for build, but now we're looking for the static file. So we're gonna go into front end, we're gonna go into build, and then static, and that will allow us to work with all of React static files. So now just make sure you're CD'd back into your Django project, and we can go ahead and run server from here. So Python manage.py run server. So remember, from your Django app, not your React app anymore. Okay, so it looks like we have a few errors. I misspelled a few things. So if we go back into urls.py, looks like I spelled template wrong. So this needs to be template. And This also needs to be template right here. And this right here needs to be template underscore name. So once we set that, this should all be working. So let's go ahead and turn on our server again. Okay, so Django is now officially serving our React app. Now, if we ever wanted to make updates, you would still have to do run build with React in order for Django to be able to find the latest files. But this is how you do it. This is the basic overview. I hope you found this video helpful, and don't forget to subscribe and leave me some feedback in the comment sections and like if it's helped you.